And then he had eventually tried meth for the first time. And I remember when he told me that, I was shocked because he had never done meth before. And I said, why is that something that you would even try? And I'll never forget. And he said, because you continue to go back to meth when you see how much it kills me and how much it destroys our relationship. So I figured it must be that good. So it's why I wanted to try it.
Welcome to Pesci's Recovery Corner. This is a recovery podcast. Recovery from what? Recovery from drug addiction, recovery from alcoholism, and recovery from mental health. I have all different types of guests on this recovery podcast. People from all walks of life, people that have had a lot of afflictions and addictions. And sometimes I even bring on professionals that work in the field with people that are suffering or struggling. So I've got the whole gamut today. Welcome to the corner. This is my friend Melanie.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
It's good to have you here. We've been talking probably for about a year about bringing you on. I want to get into some events that happened to you a while back, that you were in a relationship with somebody who passed away from addiction, who I knew very well, was a really, really good guy. But you're also a therapist. The topic of today's show is actually BPD, PTSD, and being a sober therapist.
Yeah.
So it's really good to have you here finally. Let's learn about you, about your past, about your upbringing. Where were you born in?
So I'm originally from St. Louis, Missouri.
Okay.
So born and raised, and then I moved out here in 2016, Orange County. So I've been out here since.
And what was life like in Missouri?
So life was okay growing up. My parents had a pretty toxic marriage, so that was hard growing up with. And then being an only child, I felt like I got dragged into a lot of their problems, and I just felt really alone growing up. I also struggled with some learning disabilities growing up, so I always just kind of felt like I never belonged or was an outcast.
What kind of learning disabilities?
So ADD, ADHD, and so kind of struggling too with some attention problems in school. So just a lot of special ed classes that I had to be in. And so I just always felt like, again, like I never really belonged or was never smart enough or good enough. And so that.
Were you medicated?
No.
They never
Not
gave
back
you.
then.
They never
No.
gave you ADD, ADHD medications.
No. Yeah, I tried to stay away from all that.
So did you perform well in school?
Decent, like BC student, which is surprising. I never really took school that seriously until college.
That's better than I did.
Yeah.
It's like DF over here.
Yeah, my parents were pretty strict with, getting good grades in school and going to college and everything. So
great.
Yeah.
So only child.
Mm-hmm.
Was that hard?
Yeah, it was a lot of pressure to kind of be the perfect child growing up too. So, had to be good in school or good at sports, whatever that was. And so I just felt this immense pressure to always be perfect. And so when I was 12, that's when I started cutting. That was when my mental health really started to deteriorate.
How did you learn as a 12-year-old to cut? What brought the idea to your mind?
Yeah, so one of my friends who also had some kind of issues was cutting as well. So she had kind of told me about it. And so when I started cutting, it was partially as a form of self-punishment for me for just not feeling good enough and for struggling with my mental health. But it was also a way for me to feel like I had some sense of control because I felt very out of control growing up. And so that was kind of my first addiction, I'd say, that I'd struggle with was self-injury.
Alleviate the pain that's within.
Absolutely, yeah.
Oh, right. And then any other self-harm or anything like that took place?
I've had suicide attempts in the past, yes. And so the self-injury I had struggled with up until probably 5 years ago. So that was something that I still had struggled with up until kind of recent.
When you say suicide attempts, if you don't mind me asking, like what was the actual attempt?
Yeah, so I've had 3 attempts. So my first attempt was an overdose on like over-the-counter sleeping medication. I just ended up getting horribly sick.
Did you just down pills?
Yes.
Like a lot?
Yeah, I had done kind of some research on it beforehand. And then, just basically I ended up spacing them out too far ahead. So I just ended up getting horribly sick. I just threw up for basically like 2 days straight. No one even found out about it.
Like you didn't have to get your stomach pumped or anything like that?
No, yeah, I just stayed home.
You just couldn't did you pass out and wake up?
Yeah. And then just kind of throwing up, like I said, for just 2 days straight. So it was
Oh my God.
horribly sick. Yeah. Not a good way to go. The second time, it's kind of a long story. I was about to get arrested, and then they ended up taking me to the hospital instead, because I was kind of crazy. And so I ended up trying to choke myself with I think it was the EKG cords that I had. So then I got 5150'd and placed in the psych ward. And then the third time, that was kind of another long story. I was in treatment, actually, and ended up cutting and trying to strangle myself with a blow dryer cord.
Now, did you have past trauma that led up to this to make you feel this way?
Yeah. So when I was 15, I was raped, like pretty violently raped. That was actually how I lost my virginity. And he's actually a convicted sex offender now and in prison for child pornography. And so it wasn't even
was he underage or was he over?
He was like 18 at the time. I was 15. So yeah, he was only a few years older than me. So, the actual incident of being raped obviously traumatized me. And then he had stalked me and harassed me for months after that, not to say anything that he would hurt me or hurt my mom if I told anybody. So that was really the big one that had happened to me. And a lot of my PTSD stems from sexual abuse with other men that I had had later in life too. I was raped again at 19. And so I just really, after that, really had no sense of self-worth. And I just kind of really let men treat me however they wanted to, because I just, again, had no self-respect or dignity for myself.
When did you get diagnosed for BPD, borderline personality disorder? When?
Yeah, so that was when I was, I think, 21 maybe. So I'd already been in probably maybe 10 treatments at that point. So no one could really find an accurate diagnosis for me. So I already had the PTSD, the depression, the anxiety. And I never really met criteria for bipolar, even though bipolar and BPD do have a lot of similar characteristics. Yeah, with that instability, the intense mood swings. But I didn't really have those intense manic episodes that are related to the bipolar. And so my therapist had mentioned the diagnosis of BPD too. And then when she mentioned a big part of that is the instability, the mood swings, that sense of abandonment that you always feel too. That was something I really related to as well. But I was also really heavy in my addiction, which obviously just made my mental health even worse.
When did the addiction start?
So 15.
And what was it? What did it start with?
So alcohol was the first thing I started with. And I was pretty much an alcoholic, like right when I started drinking. I didn't really start getting into drugs until 18, 19.
Okay.
And that was when my addiction had progressed a lot more.
And what kind of drugs did you get into by the time you were 18?
So it was crack and heroin were the first things.
Just like that.
Yeah.
Went from drinking alcohol to crack.
Right. Yeah.
And heroin.
Yeah. So 18, I kind of started messing around with pills a little bit. And then I was kind of just so far gone mentally at that point. I was really suicidal at that point. So I just didn't really care. And I never thought I would be an addict just because I grew up in, this upper class home. I was well educated. I always thought I knew better about addiction, that I would never end up strung out or homeless or, just kind of that typical image that we have of addicts. And I remember I tried to justify crack for a long time too.
How do you
because I was like, I can't overdose on it. You just smoke it. It's a short high, whatever it is. You try to justify it.
Right.
But
heroin you can overdose on.
Right. Yeah. And so I liked uppers a lot more. So the heroin was more just to come down from the crack.
Okay.
So that's why I was using
even out.
Yeah. To try to help me a little bit too.
You said that you went to lots of different centers, but they could never get a good read or diagnosis on you until they came up with the borderline.
Yes.
Were these places SUD like for addiction, or were they mental health, or were they both?
In the beginning, it was primary the addiction, because my addiction was really out of control in my early 20s.
Yeah.
And so, it was more kind kind of later in life. I've been to almost 40 treatment centers, so I've been in treatment a lot.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
You weren't a treatment hopper, were you?
A little bit, but even a good portion of those treatments were for mental health. So there were times that I went into treatment and was completely sober, and it was just because I was
for mental health,
literally mentally just
primary
crazy.
Yeah.
Very unstable.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now, first time you ever heard about BPD, borderline personality disorder, did you know what this disorder was?
I didn't really know, and I was scared with it being a personality disorder because from what I had heard about those were that they were kind of lifelong, that you could never really get rid of it, whereas something like bipolar, depression, anxiety, it's more so related to a chemical imbalance.
They can be stabilized.
Yeah, it's a little bit easier to treat in some sense.
For BPD, were you ever prescribed anything?
Yes, and so medications that I'm still currently taking, which I actually really recommend because so for me, I tried so many different medications for years. I felt like I could never really find that perfect combination.
Are they medications that are similar to bipolar meds?
A little bit, yes. And so they're non-narcotic medications too. So that's obviously something, I've made sure in sobriety. So, I got a gene site testing done, which is like a DNA swab that they do in your cheek.
Yeah.
And so they're able to find out with your DNA which medications actually work for you.
No way.
Yeah, it's very cool.
That's
and insurance usually covers it. So that's definitely something I recommend for people that struggle to find that right combination of meds is do that gene site testing to be able to figure out what meds you're on.
Wow.
And so, I feel like the meds that I'm on now have helped a lot with these very intense mood swings that I have because I do have these kind of short periods of mania, but for me, it's more these very low depressive moments where I do start having really intense thoughts of suicide and just really, get in those really dark places. Even in sobriety, I've had that.
Do you still sometimes experience the short periods of mania?
I do still, yes. And so that's something that's been really hard too.
So when it happens, do you think I need to get my medications leveled out or maybe something's off in the meds?
So that's what's hard too, because I feel like now I'm at a good place with my medications now. And obviously I still meet my psychiatrist regularly too. I feel it's really kind of anything can set it off, whether it's like if I'm excited about dating or something happens at work, it's just a natural kind of trigger that can set them off. But like I said, it's more so the depression that I struggle with. And a lot of that is triggered with the PTSD too. If I start getting triggers or flashbacks, that's when I start getting in those dark moments again too, of starting to feel suicidal or just kind of hopeless, even though, my life is great right now and I have all these really good things. It's just hard when those old thoughts start to kind of creep back in.
I understand. I get it. I understand completely.
Yeah.
So lots of therapy in your life?
Yes, definitely. So
you've had a lot of therapy.
Yes. Yes. One-on-one therapy and EMDR.
EMDR is remarkable.
Yeah. Type of trauma therapy. That's something that really helped me immensely too. And that's something I really recommend for anyone that's struggling with trauma. Obviously making sure, you're mentally at a point where you're able to handle it. So I know, it's not obviously recommended in detox, and even some residential treatment centers still recommend until you're like in PHP or IOP and have a little bit more sobriety before you start really kind of digging into some of those heavy topics. But it was definitely something that changed my life that I always recommend.
So so crack and heroin, how did you how long did you do that for?
So those were about 2 years. Then I got into inhalants, and then
let's talk about that.
Yeah.
You know how many phone calls I get? I mean, personally, I have a lot of experience with inhalants from a personal level. Total self-disclosure. I did many inhalants, everything from sniffing glue to gasoline, huffing gasoline to nitrous oxide, lots of NOS. That was like there was a movement. Like for a long time when we go to raves, that had to be part of that, right? Like coming down, especially, like definitely I'd like to go into other realms of my mind. So I understand why someone does inhalants. I think it's very psychological too, because it's kind of a cheap thrill. Like it's temporary, but you can go into other realms of your mind. It's pattern like, and it almost seems like at times, at least for myself from personal experience, that I felt like I had all the answers to the world.
And it was a very weird addiction too. So for me, it was primarily air duster. That was like the one inhalant I did.
Dust?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I even felt more comfortable saying like, oh, I smoke crack or oh, I shoot heroin compared to like, oh, I'm addicted to air duster. Cause it's just not a typical addiction. I don't really look
It's
like a
kind of
huffer.
embarrassing.
It
Yeah.
is. Yeah. So that was something
Like you've resorted to that?
yeah.
But you know what? It's interesting too, because before I got sober, I watched the TV show Intervention, and there was this, God, what was her name? Anyway, she was like going to Boston University. Allison on that show. You got to watch her. She's like fascinating. But
I'm walking on sunshine.
I'm walking on sunshine. Remember when
Yes.
she was, and she was like very educated, but just throwing it all away. She was sauced too, like really fucked up on this stuff. Right. And since then, and then she ended up getting sober, and I think she changed her life, which is awesome, which is really, really cool. But to see it now, I experience a lot of different people that have had a major drug addiction in the past, many different types of drugs, but they've now resorted to that, to air dusters, or what is the whippets and things like that. And it's just a way of life. It's like, and they can't stay sober. I've seen them sometimes come into our homes, I put them in treatment, and then they end up going back out again and going right back to it. It's like they're captivated. They're fascinated with it. And it's really a hard one to get over.
Yeah.
And it's not detectable like in a drug test.
Right. And that's why it was kind of easier to get away with it too. And that addiction specifically was by far had the most consequences compared to anything. You know, I
Can you tell us a little bit about
so I totaled a car 3 different times on air duster. You know, it just makes you black out.
Yep.
You know, one of those times, so I had already totaled the car that I had. So I went about 6 months without a car. My dad finally got me this brand new car. I was really excited for, had it for 10 days, went to Walmart, bought some air duster, barely leaving the parking lot, hit a light pole, just ran straight into it. And I didn't even feel it. I just woke up and my airbags were off because someone was knocking on my window. My dad was like, I just got you this brand new car. I thought you learned your lesson previously. So then I'm back to having no car, riding the metro, and back to kind of feeding my addiction.
You know, it's interesting now that you say that. I for some reason, when I used to do that, I was compelled, like I had to go drive the car. I don't even know why. I don't even remember getting in the car sometimes. But I knew that I had to do it before, and I know I was doing it in the car too. I'm really lucky I didn't something like that didn't happen for me. Although I did there was other drugs where I ended up in really weird places with the car. So.
Yeah. And then, weirdly enough, have actually been arrested like 7 or 8 times from air duster. And so because it's not an actual drug, it wasn't like a drug charge. Officially, it was like intentional misuse of an inhalant.
That was the charge?
Yeah.
This is in Missouri?
Yes, for a misdemeanor charge. And I actually got arrested one of those times when I was here too, soon after I moved. So it was because I didn't have a car for a long period of time. But I needed to get the air duster that I was addicted to. So I would take the metro, go to like Walmart or CVS, wherever it was, start huffing it. And then I couldn't even wait the 20 minutes to just wait till I got back on the metro to get back home. So I would start huffing it as I was walking there. And then
go ahead.
And then because I was huffing so much, I'd black out and have a seizure. So people would call an ambulance. So it was basically kind of like a public intoxication charge. And so the main county that I would get arrested in was called Brentwood, because that was the city that I used the metro in. And so they said they would hear on the intercom, like white female huffing air duster. And they're like, oh, that's Melanie.
They knew.
Doing it again.
You got a reputation for yourself. Now, question for you. As a therapist now, with the past addiction, especially many different addictions, but with that one, when I say it's a psychological thing that somebody resorts to using that, what is it? Like, why were we doing that?
Yeah, it's really weird because it's such a short high too. It's like
totally,
crack.
you got to keep doing it. You got to keep doing it.
Over and over again, right? And then because there's a bitterant in it too to prevent your use. So I remember like I'd have a bag next to me and I'd just start throwing up in the middle of it, wait a little bit, and then start huffing it again. Like it was just insane. And then getting burns, on my hands and my neck. The can eventually gets cold when you hit it so many times.
So cold that it freezes you.
Yeah.
Like freezer burn.
Right. It's a very weird, gnarly addiction.
You want me to tell you something crazy? Is that even I went on to do lots of inhalants, but even there was a warning in my life at a young age. I had my cousin had a friend that worked in a animal hospital, and they had nitrous oxide out of the tank, like not even a tank, like through the wall, right? And this guy would close up the place at the end of the night and sit there and just hit that thing. And he ended up putting a garbage bag over his head and put it up inside of there, and ended up suffocating and freezing his lungs.
Oh, wow.
And he died. He died.
Oh, my goodness.
Because of that. So, I mean, I had fair warning, very early on in life, but I still went on to do a ton of, we went to raves, nitrous oxide tank, like always there, always there.
Yeah, and I've had a lot of doctors at treatments tell me I'm lucky I don't have significant brain damage.
Which it can give you brain damage.
Absolutely, yeah, from how much I was huffing too.
Right.
So that's something I do feel a little bit slower sometimes, but still pretty functional for the most part. Yeah,
we are resilient.
Very.
So, how long were you addicted to inhalants?
So that was about 5 years. And then I started getting into meth after that. So I was using different drugs in different periods of my life, depending the people I was with and cities I was in and everything.
So you did the meth too, huh?
I loved meth.
Oh, I fucking loved meth for a long time. I hated it. It was a love-hate relationship.
Very much so, yes.
How long did you do meth?
So that was about 2-3 years on and off too.
Were you an IV user?
No, I was always scared to shoot it because I was pretty crazy.
Smoker?
On meth, yes.
Snorter?
Smoked it.
Smoked it.
I loved smoking it, yeah. And it was the whole ritual of it too, the pipe and cooling it down, and it was definitely the ritual.
There's a lot to it, yes.
With it too. Yep.
Now, what did you end up doing that for a while and then stopping everything?
Yeah, so the last time that I used when I got clean, that was when I was using meth. So like I said, my early 20s, that was really my heaviest use. And then since I moved out to California in 2016, I had periods where I was using, but my episodes of using have been a lot shorter since I've been out here. And big part of that is from being in 12-step programs and working the steps, because my binges would get shorter and shorter as time went on. So even the last time that I was using, I think it was like a 2-week binge maybe. But usually when I was using before, it would be months or even years that it would go on.
Did you end up in California because of treatment?
Yes.
That's what brought you out here.
Yeah, I was originally planning to just do 30 days of treatment. I had tried everything at that point. I had done hospitals, that I admitted willingly in 5150s. I did wilderness therapy at one point, which was really gnarly.
Wilderness like in Utah?
Yeah, Colorado.
Was that when
middle
you were a
of
teenager?
nowhere, Colorado. No, I was 20 that time. Yeah, I ran away after 2 weeks. Too. It was horrible.
Okay.
Would not recommend it.
So when you ended up out here in California, so you had periods of sobriety, but you weren't always staying sober because you hadn't really done the work yet.
Right.
You're sober how long now?
So I took 18 months in February, so I'll have 2 years again in this upcoming August.
Okay, congratulations, good job.
Thank you.
Along the way, you met a man that was a friend of mine.
Yes.
Who actually worked in treatment, he was like engulfed in recovery. I know this about him. I'd see him places and hear him talk, and I was like, oh, this guy's about it. I don't know if you want to say his name.
Yeah, so his name was Matt Bruno. So yeah, he was really big in the recovery community. I mean, everyone knew him. Primarily involved in AA, but did other 12-step programs too. And then he was also a program director for a big treatment center here in Orange County as well.
What happened to him?
So he ended up, we still actually don't even officially know what happened that night. But essentially he had an overdose and then he was in a coma for 8 months and then eventually ended up passing away. And that will be a year in May that he's passed.
And you were in a relationship with him?
Yes. So we had gotten engaged about a few months before he OD'd.
You guys were going to get married?
Yes.
So did you, while you were engaged, did you see did something happen to him that he ended up going in that direction, like losing his sobriety?
Yeah, so I had actually been using on and off around that point too. So I was so kind of concerned and in my own world, I didn't really notice as much as what he was doing.
Yeah.
So it started out with weed, which I feel like is a way a lot of people end up relapsing,
Yeah.
justifying it like, oh, it's not a drug, it's natural, whatever it is. I'm just
legal.
going to smoke at night. Yeah. So it started with weed, and it was kind of like, you seem like you're doing really well in your program. You have this great job. So if that's something you're going to do, and, I was smoking meth at the time, so not like I really had a place to criticize him for smoking weed. And then started drinking a lot more too. And so that's when I kind of started to see like a different side of him come out that I just had never seen before, because through the 4 years that we were together, I had relapsed on and off a lot throughout the relationship, and he had been clean the entire time. So I had never seen that side of him when he was using. And then he had eventually tried meth for the first time. And I remember when he told me that, I was shocked because he had never done meth before. And I said, why is that something that you would even try? And I'll never forget. And he said, because you continue to go back to meth when you see how much it kills me and how much it destroys our relationship.
He said that to you?
Yeah. So I figured it must be that good. So it's why I wanted to try it.
And I mean, at this point, he'd already not really had the sobriety anymore because he'd been smoking weed and drinking.
Right.
So it's like, why not do something else that might make you feel certain?
So then, he started using meth, and it was weird because we were both using it at the same time, but we would hide it from each other. We never got high together. So it's kind of, we were doing it behind each other's backs. And then it was about 2 months before he OD'd, he essentially kind of lost everything, which was really unfortunate. He lost his job. He wrecked his car. There was a whole incident with his family that happened. He had stolen some money from them, actually got their car stolen. And so it was a pretty bad relapse up until that point. And so something I haven't even, really shared publicly, but, I will just kind of now. So like I said, officially it was an overdose, which caused, that night to happen. But, as I've done this healing and thought about it and talked about it more, I really don't think it was an accidental overdose. I have really questioned, if it was intentional. And I know that's happened to other people too, that, sometimes we just write it off as, oh, they just OD'd. But it's like, if you get to that point where you're really hopeless and the drugs really start to take over, is it intentional? Because he had talked about suicide a little bit up until that point too. And so that kind of even made it harder, to think about what had happened. And so essentially the night that it happened, we had talked on the phone and he was really upset. But I didn't really think that much of it. And so that was something I struggled with for a really long time, is thinking like, what could I have said or what could I have done different? And again, we still don't entirely know what had happened that night, but he took something. Because even when he went to the hospital, his toxicology only showed alcohol and marijuana. There were no other substances in his system. But then when he went to the hospital, they gave him fentanyl for some reason. And so then when they did the second toxicology, then the fentanyl showed up. But that, we don't know if that was from what he took
or what the hospital
or from
gave.
the hospital. Yeah, but even the doctor said this brain damage isn't probably related to alcohol. Because he essentially went into cardiac arrest twice, and that was where all the brain damage came from. And so we found out about 2 months into him being in his coma that he would never fully wake up, never fully recover, essentially. And really, it was very weird. All he could do was open his eyes, but he could never make eye contact with you. But he couldn't eat, he couldn't talk, he couldn't move, just in a very vegetative state. And I had always been really close with his family up until that point, and I still am. We still have a really good relationship. But then this whole issue of the life support issue came in because he never had a will and had never put that in writing and what he wanted to do at that point. And so when the doctor said that there was no chance he would ever wake up, he had recommended hospice at that point. And that was something that I wanted for him as well, because I didn't think Matt would ever just essentially want to lay in a hospital bed and kind of vegetate. But that his parents were very Catholic, and that was something that they seemed like they were against. And so he stayed in the coma for about 6 months after that. And it was just horrible watching him deteriorate slowly day by day after that.
Oh my God.
And it was just a really horrible way to go for what a good person he was.
Yeah.
And I feel like it made it kind of almost more traumatic compared to if he would have, just died overnight, whereas it was just spread out over this long period of time. I felt like it was a lot harder to kind of work on that healing and kind of close that chapter because it was just so prolonged.
Wow.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah. And then, the day he actually passed, because his family lived out of state, I was the one that had to
Where
go.
did they live?
They are in Pennsylvania.
Oh, that's where he was from.
Yeah,
right.
yeah. So they weren't able to come out here. So then, I had to go identify his body, which was just horrible. And, those are kind of my final memories that I have of him. I don't picture him when he was really happy and all these good times we have together. When I think of him, I just picture him in this hospital bed or that last moment I saw when he had passed.
Wow.
So
I'm so sorry.
yeah. And so it really goes to show, again, he was really big in this recovery
I
community.
love that guy.
Yeah, I know. Love him and miss him. And it just shows that, even something as simple as weed can take you out. And I know for me, that led to my relapse a lot of different times too, that I had stayed clean.
It starts off minimal.
Yeah.
The little stuff.
Mm-hmm.
If you're an addict, you know how many people I know that were former heroin addicts over the years? Younger people, usually like in their 20s. They come in, some of them are crying, saying, I hate my life. Heroin addicts that they come and they are in recovery for a few years, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years. Some of them put together 6 and 7 years. And then they get a good job and a certain lifestyle. And then it starts with weed and then drink. And some of them haven't yet relapsed. I mean, relapsed to or gone back to the heroin, which these days there's no heroin really. It's all fentanyl, majority. But I think to myself, it's like they're a ticking time bomb. It's only a matter of time.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? It's only a matter of time. Like it could, and who knows? Maybe they're an exception to the rule. Maybe it might not go down that hard as it did before. Maybe you aren't a real one, right? Or as some people would say, and maybe you are. Who knows? I'm not one to judge, but it's scary. It's very scary.
It is. And for me, that's why step work has been so crucial for me, especially working step one, realizing my life is powerless and unmanageable when I'm using.
Yeah.
Because again, I would try to justify it by relapsing on weed. But even with just weed, I've never been able to smoke normally. I'm still smoking all day, every day, doing it on my lunch break, knowing I have to go back to work. Even when I was working in treatment at one point, I'm very selfish when I use, and I've never been able to just use a normal amount just on weekends or moderate it. And so that's really why part of the steps have really helped me, is admitting like I am an addict in my truest form. There is no mind-altering substance I can do normal in any kind of form, because I'm just an obsessive compulsive person. If I can, I don't drink to just get a little buzzed. I drink to black out and
to get wasted.
Yeah.
Annihilated.
Absolutely.
Oh, wow. Well, I knew last year when we talked about having you come on, like you were kind of reluctant to even open up about it, but you seem like you are very open about it. And it needs to be talked about. It needs to be known, not just by people that knew him, but like the reality of what happens or what can happen to people. I want to get back on the subject of BPD, borderline personality disorder. Obviously, your PTSD was the rapes. And maybe, was there anything else that probably led up to you having this disorder?
So a lot of just issues with men in general. I mean, some sexual abuse too. But just putting myself in a lot of dangerous, sketchy situations from using, especially, when I'm 19 years old, this cute little white girl in the city smoking crack. I'm just hanging out in areas that I shouldn't be.
Yeah.
So, a lot of men took advantage of me or abused me in different ways. And so that's where a lot of that stemmed from. And so it just was kind of like this endless cycle. If something would happen, I'd have to get high to numb out and cope with it. Then I'm hanging out with these sketchy guys, something else happens, and it just keeps going, over and over. And again, that's something that I have done a lot of work on, but even sober and working steps, I do sometimes still get flashbacks and nightmares, and that can be really triggering.
So I've worked in addiction treatment and dual diagnosis co-occurring disorder centers a lot. BPD was a term that I started hearing used 10 years ago. Didn't know what it was. One guy mentioned that he was dating a girl. He was like a guy in a 12-step meeting, that he was dating a girl and it was a shit show and that she had BPD. And I'm like, what the hell does that mean? He's like, borderline personality disorder. Within 2 weeks, I'm in a relationship and there's some stuff that happens. And then I talked to a therapist at a treatment center that I worked at. And she and I worked alongside each other really well. But one day I was like losing my mind and I went and sat down with her. I said, can I just talk to you alone? And I talked about like my relationship. Like, it's a really great relationship. I love this woman. She's so awesome. She's the woman of my dreams. I feel like we're going to like get married and have kids, this, that. But for some reason, every once in a while, something will happen. And as I described more and more, she said, well, it sounds like she might be borderline personality disorder. I'm like, wait a sec here. That guy said it 2 weeks ago. This therapist is saying it now. Down the line, as I'm telling, so with this girl, it didn't work out. The relationship didn't work out, but we remained friends. We remained friends to this day, right? But I remember like a year later when I linked back up with her and we were just hanging out, I brought up, like, I asked her, have you ever been diagnosed with any? And she goes, oh, yeah, I've been BPD for years. That's what, like, my dog, I was like, oh my God, the therapist was right about her, right? And then I had to evaluate myself because throughout my first 10 years of sobriety, I would date a lot of, like, people that it seemed like the writing was on the wall all along. Like, there's just certain personalities displayed where even if they weren't diagnosed, it seemed like they might be that, right? And then working in the field, right? I would often, if a client was about to come in, some of the staff sometimes would say things like, okay, here's this individual's coming in and they have BPD and this and that. And during the time of their stay, sometimes it seemed like some professionals almost, and like you had mentioned earlier, almost made it seem like this is a lifelong disorder and there's really nothing you can do for them. Like, there was a time I would hear that and I thought, okay, well, since they're saying it and they're the professionals, maybe they know something. But my personal experience, and the reason I say this now is I've seen miracles. I have seen people actually be able to work through it. Obviously, if a person has BPD, if they can admit to themselves, like, I've been diagnosed with this, but also want to do something about it, they can overcome a lot of the acting out or the highs and lows. And I've seen this quite often, right? So have you ever heard like a stigma that's been attached to borderline?
Yeah. And I think it, like you said, it goes back to that recovery piece from it. And I think essentially, to recover or be in recovery from BPD is just not meeting that 5 out of the 9 criteria in the DSM for what constitutes the BPD.
There's different variations of BPD?
Yeah. So, it goes to that fear of abandonment, the impulsive or compulsive behaviors, paranoia, intense anger. And so, like I said, the mood swings are something I struggle with, but also a big part for me is this black and white or all or nothing thinking too, which is just common with addicts in general because we're very extreme people, right? But that's something I struggle with in relationships a lot too. And it, again, it goes back to kind of this fear of abandonment, but it's like either I completely idolize someone and glorify them and kind of like this ride or die mentality that I give this person my everything and love them more than anything. But anytime that they make even just the slightest mistake, just by natural human mistake, then I immediately go to, I hate this person. I need to seek revenge. And it just goes to the complete opposite end of the spectrum, instead of being, more kind of level-headed and grounded with it. And so that's why it's been very hard to maintain relationships, whether that's friendships or romantic relationships too, is just going between this kind of idolizing and then hating this person as well and realizing, this instability.
I love hearing this stuff. It fascinates me. I have a special place in my heart for people with BPD. There's been times where I would get in so many of these types of relationships, but I thought to myself, do I have it? Like maybe I like have traits, certain upbringings, the way that the fear of abandonment, all of those different things. I think a lot of us go through that stuff. Now, you started working in the field I know you became a therapist. I think you had a slip as far as your recovery went, but you got back on the wagon.
Yes.
During that time. You became a therapist, but what kind of therapy?
So I do individual therapy and family therapy as well. So primarily focus on a CBT approach. So originally I was working in a detox residential program, so primary adult substance use, and now I'm working in a teen mental health IOP program. So very different population,
Hmm.
but I absolutely love it now. So I'm technically an ACSW, so I am a social worker. I'm just doing therapy.
Hmm.
My end goal is to do more social work. I'd like to do more case
What's the difference
management.
between ACSW and LCSW?
Just waiting for that official license.
So
It's
you will
that
be
one letter change.
eventually you'll be a LCSW,
Yes.
which
So
is a therapist.
yes.
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 I
I'm
think
very
it's
excited
awesome.
for
I'm very
that.
proud of you.
Yeah.
What are you doing with the teens? How is it? How's that job?
I love them. It's always been my life goal to work with at-risk youth. That's always been the main population I've been really interested in. I loved working in substance use because I could be really honest about my own recovery and share those parts of me.
Yeah.
But I feel like a lot of what I've been through is to be able to work with kids and help them out. So like I said, part of it is the individual one-on-one therapy, but then we also do a lot of family therapy as well, and really looking at the family dynamic as a whole, because a lot of them do have parents that struggle with addiction or mental
Oh,
health
really?
too, which is really interesting. You know, obviously I have friends that are in recovery or that were in active addiction that had young kids. And so I'm able to see the parents' perspective, but now I see the kids' perspective from it and how challenging it is for them to deal with parents that are in recovery or that have been using recently. So
You know, I was gonna ask you, why do you love do you love your sobriety?
I do. I'm very grateful for my life today, because there's no way I'd be able to have these things without it. There's no way I'd be able to do therapy or have my career right now if I was using. And I have good relationships with my family and friends today. Even just something really simple, like if I call my dad to check in, like I did earlier today, he knows it's not because I'm asking for money or because I need to get bailed out of jail or whatever it is. I'm generally just calling to see how he's doing because I care.
That's
And
awesome.
even just something like that, it's very simple and that he doesn't have to worry about me. Because for a long time, I remember he would like it when I was in jail or when I was in treatment because he knew that I was safe and that I wasn't getting high.
Do you think Matt passing away motivated you more to be more serious? Because you seem very serious.
It absolutely was, because I feel like if I relapse, that would be the ultimate disrespect to him to go back to it, because I really had caused a lot of damage in that relationship from my using, from just being very selfish. And then because that increased a lot of the BPD symptoms as well, too, is that, I would go through these really gnarly relapses and he'd say, I can't deal with this anymore. Like, it's just affecting my mental health and my sobriety. He would threaten to leave. I'd get really suicidal. I'd start cutting or plan out how I was going to kill myself, have to go back to treatment. And it really affects relationships in all kinds of ways too.
You don't say, listen, there was another relationship I was in where I've never called the suicide hotline until that one, because I was supposed to be at a work event. I was all set to go, and I was called and told that if you don't come here to my house right now, I'm going to kill myself. I'm like, please don't do it. Like, I got to go to this thing. Don't put me in this position. And the next thing you know, the car's going this way because I got to go rescue, because that's just who I was, right? Total empath. Like, I feel your feelings. I'm taking on your feelings. I got to come save you. Between the bathtub and a hair dryer, and it was all set up, staged. I never called the suicide hotline. Like, to be able to talk to them and tell them like what I'm going through and then walking me through it. I'm thinking, I'm already a professional in the field. This is like one component that I was always afraid of it. Believe me, when I first got sober and I was encouraged to go to school for drug and alcohol studies, I told my counselor in the beginning, there's two different populations I don't want to work with. One of them I won't mention here. The other one was definitely suicidal people. I don't want to ever have somebody die on my hands or my watch. And he said, Pej, you got to get over that. It's a lot of people that you just need to help people. Like, don't worry about who's in what mindset. But with this individual, and she was never diagnosed as BPD, but the writing was on the wall. Very scary.
It is. And because, I was so manipulative and he was so codependent on me that it was just such a toxic relationship too, that I would just feed off of him needing me and wanting me and unable to leave. And then just using that as further manipulation to essentially keep him to stay with me.
How amazing that you can tell you're honest with yourself because you're admitting this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And
I mean, a person that's in the throes of BPD, like the sickness of it, would not say it. They'd totally be in denial. They deny it all. At least that's from my personal experience.
And that's where a lot of the recoveries come into, because while I was in the relationship, I wasn't really able to look at my behaviors and take that accountability. Step work did help a little bit with that too, as far as making amends, looking at character defects, saying that, I can be manipulative or controlling or whatever it is, be very selfish, self-absorbed too. And it was really once he passed and I started processing a lot of my behaviors too, just really being able to take accountability for
major realizations.
Yeah, just how selfish I can be too. And not even just him, but again, my family and people that, were friends that I had treated horribly because of my addiction as well too. And just, that's not how I live anymore.
I love that. In my relationships, I would go on Amazon and start like looking up shit. Right? I got this book called "I Hate You, Don't Leave Me."
I love that book.
It's a great book. It's clear as day. Like it gives you a lot of clarification on what you're dealing with.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wow, I'm so impressed. Here's the deal. I want you to give hope to people because you already are. But I know that there might be somebody that looks this up and finds us and sees that we're talking about this. And I would like for you to put some good energy out into the universe and let them know that really their disorder does not need to define them. Their trauma does not need to define them. Are we agreeing upon this?
Absolutely.
Okay. Go ahead and tell everybody.
Yeah. So if I can give you really a message of hope to anyone, it would definitely be not to let your past define you, as kind of cliche as that sounds. But I feel like that's something I've really been able to use for my advantage. For a long time, even especially growing up, I was really angry at God for a long time. I didn't understand why I'd went through certain things. And now I realize that just makes me a better therapist and better able to work with the kids and the clients that I have to really be able to have that empathy and that firsthand knowledge of being able to relate to them as well. And if you are struggling with addiction, the step work really can help change your life. As far as, being able to build that concept of a higher power, looking at character defects that we have, because even when we take the drugs and alcohol away, we still have a lot of problems in ourselves too. So being able to take that daily inventory of ourselves to work on those things and really just kind of figure out what your purpose is in life and being of service to other people, whatever that looks like.
Wow. I got to say, I must say, I've thoroughly enjoyed having you on today because we be vibing. Like we definitely, there was a lot of good things, good content that we talked about. And I want to thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
And I wanted to also say that, again, this is Peggy's Recovery Corner. This is a recovery podcast. If you would be so kind as to, if you're on YouTube watching this, please subscribe, push that subscribe button. Also like it and share it. And let's get the message of hope spread as wide as we can. And until we meet again, thanks for tuning in.